A man can control everything, except his own fate. Inside the toy store, bright colors reflected off the polished glass shelves. The scent of new plastic mixed with the crisp aroma of gift wrap, while the distant laughter of children echoed like a foreign melody to Ethan Carter. His tailored suit had no wrinkles. His Rolex glinted under the store lights. He didn't belong here. His world was built on billion-dollar deals, towering skyscrapers, and calculated decisions. There was no room for surprises. And yet, something had led him here tonight. A gift for a business partner's daughter? A small distraction from the monotony of his perfectly controlled life? He wasn't sure. At the far end of the aisle, two little girls stood close together, whispering. Identical twins. Their golden hair cascaded over their shoulders, and their blue eyes sparkled as they examined the plush teddy bears in their hands. They turned them over, tracing their tiny fingers along the soft fur. Then, one of them flipped the price tag. And just like that, their excitement vanished. A pause. A shift. Their small shoulders slumped, hands loosening their grip. "Mom said no toys today," the older one murmured. Ethan stopped mid-step. Something unfamiliar stirred in him. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't pity. It was just strange to see disappointment in the eyes of children. Before he even realized what he was doing, he reached for the bears and held them out. "Take them." The twins froze. Their wide blue eyes flickered between him and the toys, full of both delight and suspicion. "Why?" the younger one finally asked. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. A simple question. A sharp one. Because sometimes people deserve something good. Just because. The older girl hesitated for only a second before hugging the bear close to her chest. The younger one studied her sister's reaction before following suit, squeezing the plush animal tight. A strange warmth settled in Ethan's chest. He didn't expect that doing something so small would feel so significant, but he had no idea that in just a few seconds, his entire life was about to change. The girls giggled as they ran toward the exit, their shoes tapping lightly against the polished floor. Outside, waiting under the soft glow of the streetlights, stood a woman. They crashed into her, grabbing at her sleeves, their tiny voices bursting with excitement as they showed her the teddy bears. She bent down, listening intently, her chestnut hair falling over her shoulder as she tilted her head. Then, as if sensing something, she looked up. And Ethan's entire world collapsed. Silence. No sound. No movement. For a moment, the world stopped turning. Because the woman standing there wasn't a stranger. It was Lena Harper. She hadn't changed. Same deep blue eyes, same long brown hair, same way her lips parted slightly when she was caught off guard. But what left Ethan breathless were the two little girls clinging to her hands. The light from the storefront illuminated their golden hair. Their blue eyes sparkled in the dim glow of the city. Eyes identical to his own. Ethan couldn't breathe. They weren't just random children. They were his daughters. The city pulsed beneath him, a vast grid of towering skyscrapers and golden-lit streets stretching endlessly into the night. From his office on the top floor, Ethan Carter watched the world below through the glass wall, his reflection a ghostly silhouette against the sprawling metropolis. Inside, the air was still, silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a sleek silver clock mounted on the far wall. Everything in this room, like everything in Ethan's life, was carefully curated. Minimalist, precise, controlled. A leather-bound planner lay open on his glass desk, every page filled with tight, neat handwriting, every moment of his day accounted for. Morning, 6 a.m. Wake, gym, breakfast, black coffee, no sugar, work, 7:30 a.m. to midnight, Meetings, deals, investments, no distractions, sleep, a controlled 5 hours, just enough to function. Never more. Ethan had built an empire on this rigid discipline, on knowing exactly what came next. He had spent years refining his life into a machine of efficiency, power, and results. There was no room for chaos, no room for surprises. Yet, as he shut his planner, something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion settling into his bones, the kind he never let himself acknowledge. Maybe it was the weight of another 13-hour workday, spent locked in negotiations with men who smiled like wolves, in boardrooms filled with numbers and ambition. Or maybe it was something simpler. The offhand remark from his business partner at lunch, about his daughter's birthday, a child turning 6. A simple celebration. A moment of joy Ethan couldn't quite relate to. He had never bought a toy before, never had a reason to. But that night, as the city hummed with life beneath him, he found himself doing something unplanned, a detour, a single deviation from his carefully structured life. The store smelled like childhood, plastic, soft cotton stuffing, and the faint scent of vanilla from a nearby cafe. Ethan stepped inside, his polished dress shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. The air was filled with distant laughter, the hushed excitement of children weaving between shelves stacked with plush animals, bright board games, and tiny dolls lined up in neat rows. This world was unfamiliar to him, foreign, disorganized, a place of whimsy where choices weren't dictated by profit margins or quarterly earnings, but by simple delight. Ethan moved through the aisles slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the shelves, searching for something that made sense. But how did one choose? What separated a good toy from a forgettable one? He didn't belong here. He felt it in the way the cashier barely glanced at him, in the way a young father nearby knelt to help his son pick out a race car, speaking in soft, affectionate tones that Ethan had no frame of reference for. But just as he turned to leave, something made him pause. A whisper, small, uncertain. 2 little girls stood at the far end of the aisle, their heads bowed together in quiet conversation. Twins, identical golden curls, bright blue eyes wide with excitement as they clutched 2 teddy bears against their chests. They held them the way a child might hold something precious, something irreplaceable. But then, one of them turned over the price tag. The shift was immediate. Their smiles faltered, replaced by the quiet understanding that this was not something they could have. They lingered for a moment longer, fingers hesitating over the plush fur, before slowly, reluctantly, placing the bears back onto the shelf. Ethan felt it before he understood it. A weight in his chest. Something unfamiliar, pressing against the walls of the life he had built so carefully. For years, he had watched the world through a lens of numbers, transactions, and practicality. He had stood across from the most ruthless businessmen, weathered economic crashes, made choices that affected thousands. But at this moment, standing under the fluorescent lights of a toy store, watching 2 little girls walk away from something as small as a teddy bear, he felt something shift. And before he could rationalize it, before he could analyze the decision the way he had done with every other choice in his life, he reached out. He picked up the 2 teddy bears from the shelf. Then, without hesitation, he called out to them. And that was the moment everything changed. Because in just a few short minutes, Ethan Carter's life would no longer belong to him alone. The toy store's door chimed as Ethan handed the plush teddy bears to the 2 little girls. Their tiny hands wrapped around the stuffed animals like they had just been given the most precious treasure in the world. For a man who lived his life in boardrooms, where words were measured in profit and losses, this moment was insignificant. Just another act of quiet generosity. Something he would forget by the time he reached his car. Or so he thought. He watched them dart toward the exit, their laughter ringing in the air. Light, effortless, untouched by the weight of responsibility he carried every day. Then, just as they stepped outside, they ran. Not toward the street, but straight into the waiting arms of a woman standing near the entrance. Ethan's breath caught. The woman crouched down, her dark hair slipping over her shoulder as she pulled them in, letting their excitement spill over her. Their little hands tugged at her sleeves, eager to show her their new treasures. She smiled, a soft, familiar curve of lips that he hadn't seen in 5 years. Ethan's entire body locked in place. No, it wasn't possible. The world blurred at the edges, as if his mind refused to process what was right in front of him. But the longer he stared, the more undeniable it became. His fingers curled into fists, his pulse a relentless hammer against his ribs. Her name slipped from his lips like a whisper. Lena. The woman stiffened. The joyful moment shattered into a sharp, breathless silence. Slowly, as if sensing his presence, she lifted her head. Their eyes met, and Ethan felt the floor beneath him disappear. It was her, the woman who had vanished from his life without a trace, the one he had spent months trying to find, only to come up empty-handed. But that wasn't the worst part. His gaze flicked back to the little girls still clutching their teddy bears, their golden curls illuminated by the streetlights, their wide blue eyes staring up at their mother. Eyes that mirrored his own. The realization struck him like a physical blow. His stomach twisted, the air in his lungs turned razor sharp. Everything around him, the soft glow of the toy store, the distant hum of the city, the muffled voices of passing strangers, faded into irrelevance. Because standing there, in the cold night air, were 2 little girls who were not strangers at all. They were his daughters, and he had never even known they existed. The silence between them was razor sharp, stretched tight by years of unspoken truths. The hum of distant traffic faded into nothing, drowned beneath the weight of what had just been uncovered. Ethan stood a few feet away, his breathing controlled but unsteady, his shoulders tense like a man preparing for a battle he never saw coming. Lena stood opposite him, arms crossed, as if trying to create a barrier between them. But it was useless. There was nowhere to run now. The street lamp above them flickered, casting long shadows that twisted between them, just like the past that refused to stay buried. Ethan exhaled slowly, hands curled into fists at his sides. His world had been built on control, on certainty. Now everything he thought he knew had been ripped apart. His daughters. 5 years. 5 years he had spent chasing numbers, building empires, making decisions that shaped industries. And all that time, his daughters had been growing up without him. A deep, aching weight settled in his chest. He lifted his gaze to Lena. There was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of what came next. She had been bracing for this moment, hadn't she? She had been preparing for the day he would find out. And yet, she never told him. The betrayal ran deep, tangled in emotions he wasn't sure how to untangle. The words finally came, sharp-edged and low. Why? Lena flinched, but she didn't answer. Ethan took a step closer. His voice didn't rise, but there was something dangerous in it, something raw. Why didn't you tell me? She turned away, staring at the pavement, but that wasn't enough. He needed her to say it. He needed to hear it from her lips. The streetlight buzzed softly above them. A cold wind stirred the hem of her coat. And then, finally, her voice broke through the silence. Because I knew you wouldn't have stayed. It was barely a whisper, but it hit him harder than any shouted accusation ever could. His breath hitched, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Lena swallowed hard, arms wrapping around herself, as if trying to hold something inside. I knew what your life was, Ethan. I knew what you wanted. And it wasn't... She hesitated, struggling to force the words out. It wasn't this. The meaning settled in his chest like lead. She had made the choice for him. Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands flexing at his sides. You didn't think I deserved a choice? Lena's gaze snapped up to meet his. For the first time, he saw it. Not just guilt, but pain. Pain she had carried alone. Pain she had buried because she thought it was the right thing to do. I thought I was protecting them, she admitted, voice tight. I thought I was protecting you. Ethan let out a sharp breath, a bitter laugh escaping before he could stop it. Protecting me? He shook his head, raking a hand through his hair. From what, Lena? From being a father? From knowing I have children? Her lips pressed together, her throat bobbing as she swallowed back the emotions threatening to spill over. I didn't want them to be an obligation to you, she whispered. Ethan stilled. Something inside him twisted painfully at the thought. Obligation. She thought he would have seen them as a burden. A breath left his lips, slow and measured, but the storm inside him raged. He took another step forward, closing the space between them. I don't care what you thought I wanted back then. His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. I don't care what mistakes we made. He let the words settle before delivering the one thing he knew for certain. But from this moment on, I am here. Lena's breath hitched. I will not walk away from them. His voice was steady, unwavering. Not now, not ever. The air between them crackled with something too fragile to name. Lena hesitated. She had been the one holding the strings all these years. She had been the one making the decisions. But now Ethan had shattered the certainty she had built. And for the first time, she didn't know what to do. Would she let him in? Would she trust him with the one thing she had been protecting for so long? The night stretched long and uncertain between them. The cafe was small, tucked away from the main road, its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. The soft clatter of cups against saucers filled the space, blending with the murmur of distant conversations. The air smelled of fresh coffee, cinnamon pastries, and something almost nostalgic, like a place where time moved just a little slower. But for Ethan Carter, time had never moved faster. He sat at the corner table, his fingers gripping the ceramic coffee cup that had long since cooled. He hadn't taken a single sip. His stomach was too tight, his chest too heavy. 1,000 thoughts clashed in his mind, each louder than the last. Would they recognize him? Would they be afraid of him? Would they even want to see him? The questions clawed at him, relentless and unyielding. Then, the soft chime of the cafe door opening. His body stiffened. He didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in. He felt it. Lena. She stepped inside first, her presence still as composed as he remembered, though there was something different about her now, something heavier in her posture, something guarded in her expression. And then they appeared. 2 small figures, clutching each other's hands, stepping hesitantly into the cafe behind their mother. The world around him blurred. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. They were real. Not just a painful what-if, not just a stolen possibility from years ago. They were real, and they were standing right in front of him. His daughters. They looked smaller than he had imagined. 5 years old, but somehow still fragile. Their blonde hair caught the dim light, their blue eyes wide and curious. His blue eyes. They didn't rush toward him. They didn't call him Daddy. They just stared. A quiet, cautious hesitation. Lena bent down, whispering something into their ears. Encouragement? Reassurance? He couldn't tell, but they didn't let go of each other's hands. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs, a dull, insistent thump, thump, thump that threatened to drown out every other sound in the cafe. He should say something. He should stand up. He should... The older one, Olivia, stepped forward first. She studied him, tilting her head slightly, her gaze sharp in a way that reminded him of himself. She was the brave one, the one who spoke first. "You're our dad, aren't you?" Ethan swallowed hard. His throat burned, his body felt stiff, but somehow, he nodded. "Yes," he managed, voice quieter than he intended. "I am." Silence. The younger girl, Sophia, clutched Olivia's hand a little tighter. She didn't speak, just watched. Lena remained a few steps behind them, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She wasn't going to interfere. This was their moment, and she was letting it unfold. Ethan didn't deserve this chance, not after missing their first words, not after missing their first steps, not after missing 5 entire years. But here he was, and they were looking at him, waiting. "I'm sorry." The words slipped out, raw and unfiltered. Not just for today, not just for the years he had lost, but for everything. The girls glanced at each other again, sharing another one of those silent conversations only twins seemed to understand. Then, Olivia spoke again. "Are you good at hide and seek?" Ethan blinked. Of all the things they could have asked him, of all the thoughts racing through their little minds, they had chosen that? Something inside him ached. Not "where have you been?" Not "why didn't you find us?" Just a simple question. A game. A childhood moment that had nothing to do with pain or abandonment or the years apart. Ethan exhaled slowly. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table between them. "I don't know," he admitted. "But from now on, you'll never have to look for me again." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, softly, hesitantly, Olivia reached out first. Her small fingers brushed against his, her grip uncertain but firm enough that he felt the warmth of her touch. Sophia hesitated. Her tiny shoulders shifted, her lips pressed together in thought. Then she stepped closer, too. And suddenly, he was holding both their hands, not in an embrace, not in some dramatic, tear-filled moment, but in something even more powerful. A quiet, unspoken promise, a beginning. The afternoon sun cast long, golden streaks across the park, filtering through the rustling leaves of the tall oak trees. The air was thick with the sound of children's laughter, the rhythmic creak of swings, and the distant barks of excited dogs chasing after frisbees. But amidst the life and movement, Ethan Carter felt completely out of place. He stood rigid near the playground, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored coat, watching the 2 little girls run ahead. His mind, so accustomed to calculating risks and strategies, struggled to process something as simple as this. A playground. A moment. 2 daughters who weren't yet sure what to make of him. They moved effortlessly, weaving between the other children like they had done this 1,000 times. Because they had. And yet, Ethan had never been here before. He had closed million-dollar deals in glass-walled boardrooms. He had stood before powerful men who waited on his decisions. He had built an empire with nothing but sheer force of will. But none of that had prepared him for this. A child's world was an entirely different universe, one that didn't operate on logic, but on wonder. And he was a stranger in it. He watched as Olivia and Sophia climbed onto the swings, their blonde hair catching the sunlight as they kicked their feet, trying to gain momentum. For a second, he thought about walking away. What if he didn't belong here? What if he failed? Then Olivia turned. Her blue eyes found his, searching, testing, a silent challenge. And in that moment, Ethan knew that if he hesitated, he would lose something he could never get back. Slowly, he stepped forward. The ground felt unfamiliar beneath his polished shoes, like he was walking across something fragile. When he reached the swings, he hesitated for only a second before placing his hands gently against the small of Olivia's back. A push. Light, careful, testing the waters. The swing moved forward. Olivia giggled. Ethan's chest tightened at the sound. Encouraged, he pushed a little harder, watching as her laughter grew, as her hair flew back with the wind, as she let herself soar. Sophia watched from the next swing, her small hands gripping the chains. Ethan turned to her, an unspoken question in his eyes. She hesitated. Then, after a beat, she nodded. He placed his hands against her back, mirroring the same movement. The swings creaked, the air filled with their bubbling laughter, and Ethan, who had spent years chasing success, realized for the first time that he had been chasing the wrong thing. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the power. It wasn't the life he had spent building for himself. It was this. The small hands that clung to him. The sound of voices calling for him. The weight of belonging. After what felt like forever, the girls slowed down, dragging their feet through the sand to stop the swings. Olivia turned first, stepping off, brushing stray curls from her face. She studied him for a moment. Curious, thoughtful, then did something he never expected. She reached for his hand, tiny fingers wrapping around his much larger ones. A simple, quiet acceptance. And then, a word, soft, tentative. Dad. It wasn't forced. It wasn't hesitant. It was just real. Ethan's breath caught. The world around him, the park, the trees, the setting sun, faded. This moment, this second, would change everything. The city stretched behind him in a haze of golden light, its skyline etched against the darkening sky. Streetlights flickered on, one by one, their glow reflecting off the wet pavement. A storm had passed earlier, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and the distant rumble of thunder fading into the horizon. Ethan Carter stood frozen. A single question hung in the air, one that had the power to unravel everything. Will you disappear again? Lena's voice had been steady, but he could hear the weight behind it, the quiet exhaustion, the years of carrying this burden alone. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The world had always made sense to him, in numbers, in equations where risk could be calculated and controlled. But this, fatherhood, responsibility, the fragile trust of two little girls who had never known his name until yesterday. This was uncharted territory. Ethan had always prided himself on being a man of certainty. But now, he was standing at the edge of something vast, something terrifyingly real. His gaze flickered to Olivia and Sophia. They stood a few feet away, completely unaware of the silent battle unfolding. Sophia clutched her teddy bear tightly, her tiny fingers gripping the plush fabric like it was her anchor. Olivia nudged her sister, whispering something, and they both giggled. They didn't know that the man standing before them had spent 5 years never knowing they existed. Didn't know that, for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter was afraid. Not of failure, not of losing control, but of letting them down. He swallowed hard. His voice, when it finally came, was raw. I'm not going anywhere. A promise. Simple, unshakable. Lena's expression didn't change at first. She had learned to be cautious, to protect not only herself but the two lives she had built from the ground up. But then, slowly, her gaze softened. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, she didn't look at him like an outsider. She looked at him like a father. A long breath. A quiet decision. See you tomorrow. And just like that, the walls between them cracked. Ethan exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening just a little. He turned toward the girls, expecting hesitation, perhaps even reluctance. Instead, Olivia smiled. A real smile. Small, but unmistakable. Sophia looked up at him, tilting her head slightly, studying him in that way children did when they were trying to understand something far bigger than themselves. Then, she simply nodded, an unspoken acceptance. As they walked toward the car, Lena watching closely, Ethan did something he never thought he would. He reached down, hesitantly, waiting, giving them the choice. And then, Olivia took his hand. Small, warm, trusting. A lifeline he hadn't known he needed. Sophia followed a beat later, grabbing onto his other hand, her tiny grip firm and sure. Ethan felt something shift inside him, something break, something fall into place. The empire he had built, the power he had fought for, the control he had clung to for years, none of it compared to this. 2 little hands, 2 little lives, and the undeniable truth that for the first time in his life, he belonged. The evening air carried the scent of autumn. Crisp, cool, filled with the distant hum of the city settling into the night. Streetlights flickered on, casting a golden glow on the sidewalk as leaves whispered against the pavement. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the park, his hands in his pockets, watching. A few weeks ago, he wouldn't have been here. A few weeks ago, he would have been in his office, overlooking the skyline from the top floor of a building he had built with his own hands. He would have been making decisions that moved millions, negotiating contracts that determined the future of corporations. But tonight, none of that mattered, because tonight, he wasn't CEO Ethan Carter. He was just a father, and in front of him, 2 little girls were running full speed in his direction, their giggles cutting through the night air, their blonde curls bouncing with each hurried step. They crashed into him without hesitation, tiny arms wrapping around his legs, their small hands gripping onto him as if he had always belonged there. The impact nearly knocked him off balance, but he didn't care. For a moment, time stood still. The world, with all its noise and expectations, faded into the background. There was no boardroom, no business deals, no endless pursuit of power. There was only this. 2 daughters. 2 pieces of himself he never knew were missing. He crouched down, pulling them in, feeling the warmth of their embrace seep into something deep, something long buried. Olivia pressed her face into his shoulder, laughing, while Sophia held onto his wrist, her tiny fingers curling into his sleeve. Ethan had built an empire. He had conquered industries. He had won battles most people never even saw. But none of it compared to this moment. Because success wasn't power. Success wasn't wealth. Success was having someone waiting for you to come home. He exhaled, letting that truth settle. Then, he turned his gaze toward the camera. How do you define success? The question hung in the air, the weight of it lingering long after the scene faded to black.